or like it's Linus who's beheaded, and he picks up his head and continues his sermon and then dies.
You can't continue a sermon. You can pick. I've heard about people picking up
It's like
their
the
head.
story, though. I mean, like it's like the tradition
No, but
of
like
the church.
in the French Revolution, there was a guy that was beheaded and picked up his head. It was nasty. But we don't focus on that gore.
We're really into it.
Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Cristina Rosetti from Utah Tech University in St. George, Utah. We'll continue our discussion where we talk about the beginnings of Mormon fundamentalism. So Cristina will kind of walk us through that, and she'll talk about some other groups that we haven't talked about so far. The Harmston group, the TLC group, Robert Crossfield, and we'll even get her opinion on Under the Banner of Heaven. So you don't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. How did you learn about this?
Reading Mike Quinn, reading just scholars reading Brian Hales, reading Craig Foster, reading just more and more.
Because Brian's got a lot of stuff on fundamentalism.
Right. And also, Craig Foster and Newell Bringhurst, Brian Hales had done a lot of work on post-manifesto polygamy.
Right.
And that was like a fairly new idea for me, because I had heard in Institute especially that polygamy ends in 1890.
It's probably news for most people who sit in the pews too.
And I heard some kind of strange justifications for polygamy in Institute. One woman told me that it was because, the story that so many men died crossing the plains, but polygamy starts before that.
Right.
So I was like, wait a minute. I heard it started in Nauvoo. So just that was kind of interesting to me. And then
it was just to take care of the widows.
There was no such thing as the anointed quorum, none of that. And then continuing to read through these brilliant people and the documents, realizing it doesn't end in 1904 either.
After the Reed Smoot hearings.
I was like, what? A lot of scholars have written a lot about that. And that was interesting to me. And as I'm kind of learning about post-manifesto polygamy, I meet Mormon fundamentalists.
You meet them?
Yeah.
At Sunstone?
At Sunstone, at MHA, at the Church History Library.
They come to MHA? I've never seen them at MHA.
Fundamentalists come to MHA. Craig Foster's co-author, Marianne Watson, is a Mormon fundamentalist.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about her. Okay.
She's brilliant. She wrote, I think, one of the greatest.
I've been trying to get her on, but she seems quite camera shy, apparently.
Her article on the origins of placement marriage, brilliant. Highly recommend. It's from Dialogue. Highly recommend. It's field-changing for study Mormon fundamentalism.
Put in a good word for me with her.
Just shoot her an email.
Her husband's the prophet now of the AUB, I think.
That is
Did you know that? Yeah,
I did know that.
You did know that. Of course you did. I'm still jealous of you. You've been to Christ Church Temple.
I have.
And I haven't. And you're not even Mormon.
I'm not.
And I talked to David Patrick. You know David.
Yeah, he was
here.
here.
I was like, I have a temple recommend even.
Do you have the right temple recommend?
No,
Rick?
That's the problem.
Right. But yeah, I realized that polygamy doesn't end in 1890. It doesn't end in 1904. It doesn't end in 1933. It never ends. And
it ends officially in 1933.
But I mean, it doesn't end in general. It ends in the LDS Church.
Right.
But it doesn't end.
I mean, it's still
broadly.
Going.
It's still going. And that was interesting. What I was actually more interested in, I wasn't so much interested in the polygamy. I was really interested in how the line of authority worked that allowed for it to keep going.
Right.
That's what really interested me. And some
of my listeners might not know that. Do you want to tell that story?
Sure. So it's really kind of the story. It's a complicated story, but the story that a lot of Mormon fundamentalists tell is that in 1886, John Taylor's in hiding. And he's in hiding largely because of the federal government is starting to disincorporate, or is considering disincorporating the church. It's disenfranchising women. It's threatening to do a lot in terms of the territory. It's a really difficult time. And John Taylor is in hiding, and a lot of his associates are saying, you need to inquire of the Lord of what to do about this.
With the idea of maybe he would get rid of polygamy, right?
I mean, John Taylor was ride or die for the principle. Like, if a prophet was going to get rid of it, it wasn't going to be John Taylor.
I've heard speculation that when Wilford Woodruff became president, people were like, "Oh, he's going to get rid of it." Have you heard that?
I haven't.
Oh,
it does. Yeah. I mean, can you imagine? John Taylor is probably like rolling over. Like, I don't know. It's a tough one because like John Taylor was willing to die for this. John Taylor.
Well, he died in hiding.
He died in hiding, but John Taylor believed Brigham Young. Like Brigham Young says that you cannot become gods, even the sons of God, without entering into the practice of plural marriage. John Taylor believed him. Like, John Taylor was a believer in this. And so John Taylor in 1886, he's in Centerville, Utah, and he ends up going to pray. And in the later accounts, so this is one of the complicated parts is that later, we have accounts from later on, but later, one of the men who was there, his name was Lawrence C. Woolley, he recounts that he saw a light shine from under the door that John Taylor was in. And the story goes that over a period of 8 hours, it's called the 8-hour meeting, over a period of 8 hours, he met with the resurrected Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith. And he comes out with a revelation. The revelation is authentic. It is written in John Taylor's hand. The later events regarding it are where it's a little murky. But he ends up writing a revelation which basically says, none of my commandments can be revoked. None of my ordinances can be changed. Thus saith the Lord. Within the context of the revelation and everything, it's assumed that means plural marriage is here to stay. So that happens. Now, the 1886 revelation is not unique for John Taylor. 1882, John Taylor's really saying the same. Like, John Taylor's always saying this. Like, this isn't unique. What makes this story unique, though, is in 1922, Lawrence C. Woolley starts telling a story that changes everything, where he starts telling people not only was that revelation there, but John Taylor set apart a group of men to continue the practice of plural marriage, world without end. And Lawrence Woolley argues ultimately that he is one of those men and that he has the authority to perpetuate plural marriage. This group, he eventually ordains other men. This becomes the Council of Friends. This is the modern fundamentalist movement, or when it really begins. All of the men,
which leads to the FLDS, the AUB, and all
of the groups.
Right?
Yeah, so
pretty much. There's some that kind of outside that, but
kind of outside. But in the 1950s, there's a big split in the Council of Friends. The split is over somewhat a controversial ordination that happens. It's over how we're going to do communitarianism. It's over how we're going to do a million things. And there's a big split. The split ends up following in the line of John Y. Barlow on one side, which becomes the FLDS, and Joseph Musser on the other side, which becomes the AUB. So that's kind of, and then from there. Within that, though, Lewis Kelch was one of the early men within this movement. He's kind of considered the father of the independent movement. So independent Mormon fundamentalists have existed from the inception of the modern Mormon fundamentalist movement. So it's been a diverse movement ever since then. But that was really interesting to me in how the priesthood claims and the authority claims were reconfigured in a time where people were really struggling with what to make sense of the end of polygamy. Like, what does that mean? Like, tangibly, that sounds so complicated. What does the end of polygamy mean? Like, how do you do the end of polygamy? Does it mean mass divorce? Does it mean, like, what happens to the kids? Are the men not involved in these kids' lives anymore? What happens to the women? What happens to the children who were taught that you have to be polygamous to go to heaven? What happens to this? How do you do this? How do you end polygamy? And so the 1910s, 20s, free dissertation idea, the 1910s is so understudied. But the 1920s, 30s was this time of really trying to figure out, what are we going to do? Like, how are we going to be Mormon in America in the 20th century? And so that was just so interesting to me, especially with the relationship with the LDS Church, that some LDS leaders were still practicing polygamy or still solemnizing plural marriages. Some of them were like friends with the fundamentalist movement, which again, of course they were. they're in Salt Lake City. They're all going to church together. Of course they were. Like, I'm in copy edits of a book I wrote on Joseph Musser. And one of the really interesting things about Joseph Musser, his mission president was...
So we're going to have you back on for your book release?
Joseph Musser's mission president was J. Golden Kimball.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Southern states. And Joseph Musser's excommunicated. He and J. Golden Kimball continue writing each other letters until J. Golden Kimball dies, and Joseph Musser goes to his funeral. Like, this is a complicated time of being excommunicated, being an apostate. It, for polygamy at least, he's friends with J. Golden Kimball still, right? Like, it's a complicated thing. And so that was what was really interesting to me, is how do these multiple expressions of Mormonism interact together in this time where what it means to be Mormon is a big question.
Wow. Well, and I know that Rulon Jeffs knew Hugh B. Brown and Gordon B. Hinckley.
Yeah, he was married to Zola Brown.
Yeah.
And Hugh B. Brown's Homer Brown was friends with the movement. So there's a lot of...
Homer is Hubie's father?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, Homer Duncan Brown was friends with a lot of the fundamentalist men. So...
Well, it is kind of funny because you have the 1890 Manifesto, and so the idea was, at least publicly, and I should say the public idea was, okay, we're not going to make you divorce all your wives. You know, you can still be a good church member. You can still come to church. Just don't take any more. Like, we're done.
Right.
So the idea was we're going to gradually just wind this down.
Right.
But they had kids that didn't want to wind it down.
Right. I mean, it's hard too. So in 1909, so Joseph Musser, I know I mentioned him a lot, but he just happens to be the early member of the movement that I just know the most about.
Right.
Joseph Musser goes to a disciplinary council in 1909. He's called to a council in the Salt Lake Temple. Imagine going to a disciplinary council in the Salt Lake Temple. And he, in his diaries, he complains that he had to wait 20 minutes. He just had to sit and wait. But he's called into a council, and the men in the council, it's Heber J. Grant, it's Anthony W. Ivins, it's Rutger Clausen, and he looks at these men and he's like, "Really?
You're gonna excommunicate me?
You're gonna do really? This is what you're doing?" And he calls him on it. He's like, "Who amongst us has not agreed with plural marriage in recent years?" And especially,
so they were going to excommunicate him because he had taken a
They were disciplining him. So there wasn't...
Because he had taken another wife?
Yeah. So
after 1904, at least,
yeah,
right?
1906.
Okay.
Matthias Cowley seals him to Mary C. Hill. And...
Matthias Cowley in the Quorum of 12.
Yes. Seals him.
This is why Matthias gets dropped from the quorum.
Not necessarily just because of Musser's sealing, but Musser's sealing was among them.
Yeah.
He and Joseph Musser was sealed again to
1906 is also when David O. McKay became an apostle to replace Matthias Cowley.
So there's a lot going on. Musser was sealed again by Judson Tolman, who was a patriarch back when patriarchs had sealing authority. Judson Tolman is renowned for being a sealer of the fundamentalist movement, or sealed a lot of people. But Musser goes to a disciplinary council in 1909 and basically says, "Who amongst us has not done this?" And he knows, he looks at Heber J. Grant, he's like, "You're a polygamist. Not currently, right? But you practiced polygamy."
Right.
Heber J. Grant's the last polygamist.
He's an apostle at the time.
Right, at the time. He's the president of the Quorum of the 12.
Oh, Heber was president?
Yeah, because he's going to be the prophet next.
Right.
And...
Oh, did he replace Joseph F. Smith?
Yes.
Okay.
Heber J. Grant and George Albert Smith.
Oh my gosh.
David O. McKay.
Where did you learn that?
Oh.
Did Lindsay teach it to you?
Been around.
I don't know that song.
What? You didn't learn that in primary?
That was not a primary song when I was in primary. I'm old.
Latter-day Prophets are number one. Oh my gosh. So it's actually how I memorized them, to be fair.
Awesome.
It's how I learned them, because I realized I should know them.
Maybe I should learn that song.
Oh my gosh. It was the easiest way for me to learn them. But It's how I learned the books of the Bible too. Like I still have to think about the Bible song. But yeah, so he also does the loophole thing where he says, this is out of order. None of you are my stake president.
Well, he's got the second anointing, so he's like,
well, he does have a second
doesn't
anointing.
matter.
He does. That's true. He does have a second anointing, but also that's true that none of them are his stake president. And that is the order of how you're supposed to go about discipline in the LDS Church. Now, the problem is his stake president, William Smart, is a polygamist. So that's not going to discipline him. And like he and Smart had like this, were considering like recreating the United Order. Like they were doing a lot. And they were business partners. Smart's not getting rid of him. So, or not going to discipline him, certainly.
So the 12 actually had to discipline themselves?
Well, this is the best part of the story. Nothing happens.
Oh.
That's it. He's let go.
Really?
Yeah, nothing happens.
Until?
1921.
Okay.
But that's a long time.
Yeah, that's 12 years, yeah.
And it only happened because there was like a kind of story where what's hard is he was accused of courting a woman, Marion Bringhurst, and plotting to be sealed to her.
He's got to relate. She's got to be related to Newell, right?
She is.
I'm sure. Yeah.
But none of that never happened.
He didn't court this.
He denied it. He denied it forever, and the sealing never happened. So there was no sealing, and he, in his diaries, in his private diaries, he denied this ever happening. And he notes, he's like, she's a great gal. Not married to her. At all. And then, so he is finally excommunicated in 1921. His excommunication is posted in the Deseret News.
Did he have any other marriages after 1909?
So one of the hard things is, I mentioned I wrote his biography, and I'm still trying to figure out how many sealings he had.
How many do you know of?
Well, so what's hard is Marianne Watson, she noted 15. So I don't know many of their names. So I know that he was married to Rose Selms Borquist. He was married to Ellis R. Ship Jr. That is Ellis Reynolds Ship's daughter.
Okay.
Mary Caroline Hill. Myrtle Anderson, who's only sealed to him for like a minute. She pieces out pretty soon. She doesn't like it.
So she divorces him, basically?
Yeah, she doesn't like it. She moves. She leaves Utah. But a lot of Marianne Watson noted knowing about her. So that wasn't, I thought it was like this moment where I found, where Brian Buchanan and I were looking into the documents because we're publishing Musser's diaries with signature books. And we thought we found a plural wife. And Marianne Watson was like, no, we all knew about her. And I was like, of course you did, because... and then Lucy Okamech, who Lucy is, her and her sisters are married to many of the men in the council. So those are the ones that we have solid, firm evidence of their sealings. But I don't know much about the others, and I don't know their names. But according to several people who, like Marianne Watson, there were more than that. I just don't know their names. So I do note that there are additional sealings.
So Marianne Watson says there's 15, but she doesn't know the names?
We were at MHA when she told me, so I didn't ask her to continue this rabbit trail. But, what is difficult is that fundamentalist sealings, especially in this period, are very hard to find documentation for. And so...
I wonder why.
Just yesterday...
Could it be a secret thing?
I know. Just yesterday, Brian Buchanan sent me a news clipping of a woman, and he was like, I think this is one of Saint's wives, and just for a variety of reasons. So he's looking into that right now. But so I was just so interested in how these multiple ways of multiple lines of authority happen, how they manifest in the present. It's just been such an interesting story.
Wow. Very cool.
And then I did get to go in a temple once.
Yeah.
I've only ever been in one LDS temple. So.
Oh, you've been in the LDS. Are you coming up to Saratoga Springs? You can go in another one.
Well, I'm waiting for St. George. I'm waiting for St. George.
Oh.
The OG.
Well, if you want to go in April, Saratoga Springs open house.
I'm waiting for the OG temple. But I went to the open house for Jordan River.
Oh, okay. And so, well, you were asking me beforehand. So we've got the St. George Temple, and what's the other one called?
I think it's called Washington Fields.
And it's nearby here somewhere?
It's like, right, I don't know. It's by Quick Quack Car Wash.
In Washington.
Well, it's in St. George.
Oh, it's in St. George.
Yeah, so it is in St. George.
So this is another city with 2 temples.
It's going to be another, yes. Yes, it is. But apparently the St. George Temple is busy, and it is pretty small.
Right.
So, and there are a lot of LDS people here. So, I mean, I don't know.
Well, and you've got Cedar City too, but yeah.
Right, Cedar City has a temple, and Vegas has a temple.
Right.
I think that's about it in the area. Because the next temple after Cedar City is probably Payson.
Yeah, unless you want to go to Monticello. It's a different direction.
Right.
Yeah.
Or Manti, I guess, would be.
Yeah, Manti is closed for renovations right now too.
Right, but that's closer than Payson.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have a student who just got married, and they got married in the Bountiful Temple.
Okay. Well, I'm just telling you, Saratoga Springs open house is April, May, and June.
I'm not going to drive to Saratoga Springs.
Oh, come on. You got to go to Salt Lake for something.
I do. I will drive.
3 months.
I will drive up for the Salt Lake open house when that finally happens. But
Okay.
I was talking to during the planning or the getting ready for the Juanita conference. I was talking to the mission president in the tabernacle because we used his space. And he and his wife said that the Salt Lake Temple might not be done for a few years.
Yeah. Yeah. Supply chain problems everywhere.
But I'm definitely going to plan to be there for the St. George one, just because that's such a historic building.
I'm scared to see. Well, actually, I guess they remodeled it years ago, and
the plans for it, if you go in the visitor center, the plans for it look beautiful. And it looks like it is like a true, like restoration of it, and that it does look more true to the original.
Oh.
It looks beautiful inside. Like the plans for it that they did really do look beautiful. I know there was a lot of controversy with Manti
And Salt Lake.
I haven't heard a lot of rumblings.
I'm scared what they're going to do to Salt Lake. Ugh.
I don't know. I have heard a lot of rumblings. I haven't heard any rumblings about St. George, though. People just seem pretty happy with how it's going. They did add a big addition to it for an entryway that is kind of similar to what Salt Lake has.
Okay.
But I don't know. When did they stop using the actual doors on temples?
I don't know.
On the historic temples?
I mean, that's just where they take all the pictures for the weddings now.
Yeah, but like, those doors had to have been used at one point.
I would think so, but I can't tell you. I don't know.
Interesting.
I'm not a Pioneer Temple expert on that. So
Same.
all right. So we were talking about the split in 1950, the split?
1954.
And so that's where the
there's contestation between 1952 to 1954.
Okay. The 1950s, there's a split between the FLDS and the AUB.
Mm-hmm.
And
they don't have those names yet. That's an important thing. Yeah.
And I mean, I guess it was kind of the Allred group and the Jeff's group.
A lot of them called it the work.
The work.
Mm-hmm. I mean, fundamentalists
on one side or the other, or
a lot of fundamentalists in Short Creek, especially during like Leroy Johnson's presidency, referred to what they were doing as the work. So varying names, but the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints isn't incorporated until 1991 as like an official entity.
I thought it was 1980. It was 91? Really? It was that late? Oh, I didn't realize that. Wow.
And the AUB...
didn't they organize more in the 80s, though?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But like, I mean, in terms of like an incorporated entity with like recognition for this name and like the entity of what it is.
Okay. And then the AUB was in what year?
I don't know the exact year that the AUB was incorporated formally.
Was it before or after? Any idea?
Oh, it was before.
It was before. Okay.
Yeah, they were in the early 70s.
And so, well, and I understand you're a TLC, which is the Harmston group.
Yeah, I wrote one chapter of my dissertation on the TLC. I've submitted
the True and Living Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right?
The True and Living Church of Jesus Christ of Saints of the Last Days.
Oh, okay. So we got to mix it up a little bit.
The red brick store with Jim Harmston. Their buildings are still there. The signs are down though, like
in Manti.
Yeah, in Manti.
When did he kind of get going?
So the TLC was really interesting to me for a similar reason, because like if you don't have a line of authority, how do you start? And Jim Harmston was a really interesting example of someone who he's not connected to the Council of Friends. He's not connected to Musser or Woolley or any of these men. And he very kind of out of the blue emerges as a fundamentalist leader. He incorporates his church his church starts, it's organized in 1994. And his church is organized through the True Order of Prayer. What ends up, so a lot of families.
Could we call him kind of an independent fundamentalist?
So early on, so he had a Bible study, like a Sunday school Bible study type thing that he would do in his home. And a lot of people traveled from like all over to it. Like it was a really well-attended Bible study that people loved. He was really smart. He was charismatic. He knew the doctrine. He knew the scriptures. Ogden Kraut went to it for a while. It was
He's with all the groups.
I learned that from Anne, who I know you've had on, that he attended it. Like so many people say like, oh, my aunt went to it, or a lot of people in the fundamentalist movement have some connection to knowing someone who went to it. And in 1994, some families at the time had altars in their home, had home altars. Altars have a long history, of course, in the LDS Church, and altars existed in stake centers sometimes, but some families had them in their homes. And Jim Harmston was one of those families that had an altar in his home. And one evening in 1994, he kneels at the altar with his wife, and in the later accounts of this, the veil opens between this world and the next. And he is ordained at the hands of the apostles. But there's varying stories to this. In some accounts, he sees the three Nephites. In some accounts, he sees the great patriarchs of old. And all that to say, he is instructed that he is a re-restoration, that the restoration has fallen so greatly into apostasy that on one hand, Lauren Woolley tells that there is an unbroken line of succession. It's just outside for priesthood. It's just outside of the LDS Church and the institution. Jim Harmston makes the argument that it is so corrupted that there had to have been a re-restoration.
So he's the new Joseph Smith.
And he is that. He is a reincarnation of Joseph Smith.
Oh.
Through multiple mortal probations. One of the interesting things with him.
Like reincarnation?
So multiple mortal probation. So from my understanding from speaking with a couple former members of the TLC, is they discussed how it's a little different than reincarnation in that you can only be born into a human body gendered the same gender. So you could only
well, that would be a problem, really.
You could only come back as a man,
right,
human being. You couldn't become anything else.
Gender is eternal.
And so that would be the family proclamation. And so that would kind of be their subtle distinction. But multiple mortal probations is an interesting doctrine that has historic roots. A lot of them will trace it back to Heber C. Kimball. Heber C. Kimball talked about how if you are not perfected in this life, maybe you'll get another chance in another probationary period. They also draw on Brigham Young, Brigham Young had some comments that basically all men will have to become saviors of a world before attaining their final exaltation as God. And so through a lot of these 19th century doctrines, the TLC came up with their own understanding of multiple mortal probations, that all people travel through multiple probations before attaining their final exaltation. Many would say, one of the really kind of interesting things about the TLC is that the TLC would give patriarchal blessings. And in their patriarchal blessings, many people learned their past probations of who they were in their past lives. So some people would find out that they were Parley Pratt. Some people would find out that they were really kind of great figures of old.
I was just going to say, they're never just like, yeah, you're Joe the slave or something, a no-name person.
You're usually not the person in the Bible that is like, and 4 people traveled alongside. You're usually not that person. And they understood that, though, in a very particular, because I asked that question, and they understood that if you were a member of the TLC, you were among the elect of the Latter-day Saint tradition. So, of course, you were going to be someone who has traveled through significant past probations. If you landed in the TLC in this life, of course.
You were elect.
Of course you were elect. in a past probation. So they have this theology that works in that way. A lot of Brigham Young, and then later fundamentalist leaders talked about passing through different offices. Joseph Musser really elaborates this in his pamphlet, Michael, Our Father and Our God, where he talks about, and Ogden Kraut somewhat, but Joseph Musser really does, where there's different offices of God, of the Godhead. And there is the Father office, the salvific office, and then the witness testator office. And some would say that you have to pass through the office of witness testator, and then you have to become a savior of a world, and then you can finally attain your last exaltation. So because of this, a lot of fundamentalist groups talk about Joseph Smith being the Holy Ghost, that the Holy Ghost does get a body. He gets it in the fullness of time. Joseph Smith is nothing if, as a prophet is nothing if not a witness and testator. And so Joseph Smith is the Holy Ghost, and then potentially is in a salvific office at this time, or in the past few years, and then attains his final exaltation, which is the Assumption. Jim Harmston ultimately makes the claim that he is Joseph Smith come again, and therefore the Holy Ghost.
Wow.
So I've heard from a couple past members, and so I can't verify if this is true for the TLC, but one former member mentioned that there was some talk that he was in the office of Elohim. I can't verify if that's actually
true. Who was in the office of Elohim?
Jim Harmston after his death.
Oh, he's now Elohim because he went from Holy Ghost and he got promoted to Elohim.
Through different offices. So I can't verify if that's TLC
I mean,
doctrine.
is this kind of the Adam God ladder?
Yeah, so I mean, the Adam God doctrine, a lot of people associate with Brigham Young. Of course they do, because of his sermon. But the fundamentalist movement doesn't stop there. They definitely build on the doctrine and elaborate on how it all interworks. Joseph Musser's Michael, Our Father and Our God is really kind of the quintessential work that it extrapolates and goes beyond just what Brigham Young said to really try to make sense of this idea. The way he does it is really cool in the book. And he's really where we first start to see, he and Lauren Woolley, where we first start to see that Joseph Smith is the Holy Ghost. And so they really kind of build on this idea, and Jim Harmston really grabs hold of this, and people come to believe that he is Joseph Smith. What is interesting is that he dies on the anniversary of Joseph Smith's martyrdom. So, which only...
Just from natural causes?
He has a heart attack. So, okay. Yeah. But I mean, Jim Harmston, though...
How old was he roughly?
I don't remember how old he is.
60?
I wrote this so long ago. It was such a long time ago. It is always important to mention that as much as Jim Harmston was beloved and has such an interesting story, there are significant allegations of abuse within the TLC that are always worth noting and always worth discussing. There is a book by a woman named Rachel Strong who talks about her experience in the Harmston group. So that's just something that is worth noting, that it did become widely known in the state of Utah for underage marriage. It did become widely known for abuse. So that is also a part of the TLC story that can't be just kind of brushed over and not told. But what's so interesting about the fundamentalist movement is most of them, of course, trace their lineage to the Council of Friends. But there's fundamentalist groups that are born all the time.
I know.
You're like, I'm aware.
I've had some on my podcast.
Yeah, Christ Church comes out of the AUB. Centennial Park comes out of the FLDS. Like all the time, just new religions.
Well, and I don't know if you probably don't follow RLDS schisms like I do, but there's a new church, the Everlasting Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter Days. Jim Van Cannon, who was an early guest in my first year, he was in the Remnant Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, not Denver Snuffers Group.
Right.
This is Fred Larson.
Okay.
They were incorporated around 2000, I think. Fred lived into his 90s, and probably 2-3 years ago, I think he was 95. He died. They had a schism
Right.
And so Jim was in the first presidency. He was Sidney Rigdon. Terry Patience was the Quorum of the 12 Apostles.
Love
he was
that
Brigham Young. Brigham Young won.
Right.
Jim schismed, and Everlasting Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that's just within the last couple of years.
Wow.
And so I went to Independence, and it was so weird. I got this really dumpy motel in Independence, and I saw the sign for the Everlasting Church, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's Jim's church.
What was there was like a name that they used when Community of Christ emerged, the people who wanted to remain RLDS. What was the name that some of them used? Do you remember?
Restorationists?
Restoration Branches.
Yeah.
That's the name that I was looking for in my head.
Yeah.
That just came to mind. Those are the only two kind of that I know, is that there's Restoration Branches and then there's Community of Christ.
Yeah. If you go to Independence, like just drive around. You've got
sure.
The Restored Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Remnant Church of Jesus Christ, the Everlasting Church. Like you're just like, there's Mormons everywhere.
I mean, I think
they don't call themselves Mormons, but I do.
And that's such a, I mean, again, free dissertation and book idea. Like there's so much talk about the different groups that break off from Brigham Young and the tradition that comes west.
Oh yeah.
But there's just not enough history. Like I am completely uninformed about the breakoffs from the RLDS.
Oh.
And there's different groups that all connect themselves to Strang. So I mean,
well,
I would love that history.
And that brings up two things that are kind of related. Bill Russell talked on my podcast recently about Jeff Lundgren, who most LDS people never heard of, but he is the Ron and Dan Lafferty of the RLDS Church.
Yeah, I remember during when Under the Banner of Heaven came out, a lot of that came up.
Right.
I saw it on Facebook, and that was the first time I had heard about it. Was seeing people post on like different Facebook groups.
There was a recent podcast about Ron Lundgren. I'm trying to remember what it was called, and it's like a murder podcast where they talk about different murders. Let's see if I can find it here really quickly. I just subscribed because I'm as fascinated at the podcast is called "Who Killed?" ... and let's see if I can find the It's the February 2nd, the Kirtland cult killings, part 1 and 2. It is marked explicit, so there is some language issues there. But they go into that big time, and it's funny, Jeff Lundgren, because he's not. He's a former RLDS, so they hate polygamy. But he wants other people's wives.
Yikes.
It's just crazy.
Yikes.
And it's a terrible, terrible story. Under the Banner of Heaven, did you have anything to do with that? Or
Nope.
No? Okay.
No, I wrote an article for Religion Dispatches, but no.
Any impressions of it? Is it accurate, inaccurate?
It was definitely fictionalized. There was a lot of additions. The part that I think was so interesting did you see it?
I have not seen it, and here, I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because I'm a cheapskate, and I wanted to get it was on Hulu, I think, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, I knew that if I signed up right away that I wouldn't get to see the whole series because it was over 6 weeks or something, and I wanted to get the free 1 month subscription.
Right.
So I waited a few weeks, and then everybody's like, it's not worth watching. So I never watched it.
Well,
Was it worth watching?
If you like true crime, I watched.
But it was fictionalized. That was the big issue. The detective was a fictional detective. Like he was. What I heard, the critique I heard was he was to represent like a faith crisis guy. Like they invented him. Like he was like a composite character.
He was based on someone not related to the story, but he was based on a person who was a police officer. I liked it. Again, I'm not LDS. I'm not connected to this story.
You went to a young single adult ward, but you're not.
I say ward.
You're not quite into the culture enough. Would you say?
I'm not connected.
Do you understand it?
I'm not connected to the story enough to have had like a really strong opinion about it. I stopped listening to true crime. I used to really like My Favorite Murder, and then I stopped listening to true crime a couple of years ago. So, but I mean, I liked it. The part that I thought was so interesting about it, there's a scene in the second to last episode, I believe, where Ron goes to Oregon and he is at like a ranch and he's like, there's like frolicking and wine. And then he's baptized by this man who kisses him. And a lot of people were really scandalized and they were like, what is happening? But one of the interesting things about that was someone, a fundamentalist man, was consulted for that scene because that was a real group in Oregon that Ron Lafferty looked into for a while.
The Bundys?
That looked into for a while, that had a lot of these kind of really controversial practices, and had a lot of sexual practices in their tradition. And so I thought like some of those I think in the grand story arc, there were a lot of big criticisms, but I thought those little things were really interesting because they reflected these little known parts of fundamentalist history that I thought were interesting. A lot of people were really quick to criticize its representation of the LDS Church. One of the interesting things was it wasn't quick. No one was really kind of quick to criticize its representation of fundamentalism.
Was it good?
Was it
a good representation of fundamentalism?
There were a couple things that I thought were really well done. The first was when Ron and Dan Lafferty go and visit Short Creek. They're never members of the Short Creek community. But I thought it would have been really easy to put all the women in prairie dresses, but prairie dresses weren't worn yet at that time.
That didn't happen till like the 2000s,
and so,
right? Or even later.
It was in like the 80s. In like the 90s, they started to get more and more kind of
prairie dress
looking like that. Okay. But I thought that was kind of interesting that they like paid attention to that. And then secondarily, I thought the representation of Robert Crossfield was really well done.
Oh. Because he has his own story, right? Robert
the
Crossfield?
prophet Onias. Yeah.
Can you talk about him? Because Steve Shields talked a little bit about him, but I don't have a lot of detail on him. Other than Steve thought he was a terrible person.
Yeah, I do think he was abusive. He was an abusive father, an abusive man who taught doctrines that were abusive. Especially to his family. But he was very similar to Jim Harmston in a lot of ways. One of the things about that time period, the 1980s and 1990s, was really a high point in seeing people who were, Sunday school teachers or were doing home meetings, and they start their own groups out of that. And Robert Crossfield was very similar to that story in that he is a Sunday school teacher. He's starting his own home meetings. He's starting Bible studies.
Is he also in American Fork? Do you know?
He was in the Salem area.
Okay, so that's just a little farther south than Utah County.
And he starts to slowly receive his own revelations, and he ends up publishing those revelations under the pseudonym the Prophet Onias. Mm-hmm. And he starts the School of the Prophets, which eventually is joined by the Lafferty brothers. But that group, it was always very small, but it spoke to what a lot of people in the 1980s and 1990s were looking for. The 1980s and 1990s were a time, as you know, of significant change in the LDS Church. And with the significant change in the LDS Church, there was significant disenfranchisement among a lot of people, especially around the temple. And so the Prophet Onias was one of those people that was trying to speak to people's really disheartened feelings toward the direction the LDS Church was going. He just happened to also be, as Steve Shields noted, not an abusive person.
So, he wasn't a murderer like the Laffertys, though, right?
He was not.
And the Laffertys kind of broke off from him, or did he kick him out, or do you know?
He condemned the murders soon after. Very soon after, he published a statement saying no. When the Lafferty brothers came to the School of the Prophets with the revelation about that they were going to commit this atrocity, the School of the Prophets did say this isn't a revelation. So they did. The group did immediately say no, this is not from God.
Well, you're talking about the revelation where to kill Brenda Lafferty, right?
Yeah.
And I don't remember who got Ron or Dan. I get them mixed up all the time.
So they couched it in Revelation, and
there was a revelation to kill Brenda.
And they brought it forth to the school of the prophets. And the school of the prophets said, no, this is not, we're not signing on to whatever nonsense this is.
And they just went and did it anyway.
And they went and did it anyway, unfortunately. Like, tragically, they went and did it anyway.
And killed her 2-year-old daughter, too, as well.
Unfortunately.
And she was upset because, was she married to a brother?
She was, and she
didn't like their polygamy talk, and right?
No, and she was also outspoken against the abuse she saw in the family. I mean, she was, her sister has spoken quite a bit about Brenda, but tragically she dies, and the School of the Prophets did release a statement soon after, condemning it. But the School of the Prophets, it's hard to. Right, if you know someone who is close friends with you who does something horrendous, it's very hard to and you're part of the religion. It's very hard to be like, we had nothing to do with it. So the School of the Prophets ends up kind of getting a bad name and getting a bad rap after that. And they eventually, Robert Crossfield dies. I think he dies pretty recently. It was like 2012.
Okay.
He dies pretty recently. There was a very brief moment where someone claimed to be the successor of Robert Crossfield. He has since recanted.
Oh.
So there is no official successor to Robert Crossfield.
Okay. And so Robert Crossfield, did he kind of stay in the Salem area?
Yeah, it didn't expand. It wasn't.
He didn't move to Canada?
Oh, he does for a while.
That's what I thought. I thought he went to Canada. You don't know that?
I don't know the whole story about him. But yeah.
Yeah. And so then, okay. I have some fundamentalist friends. I'm sure you do too. A second book of commandments.
That was Robert Crossfield.
That's what I thought.
Yep. There's a website, 2bc.org.
And I think it's .info, if I remember right.
Even better.
And because there are still adherents to the second book of commandments. So those are related to Robert Crossfield.
Yeah.
So it does seem like the group's kind of still around.
I mean, in a very it's not in an organized fashion. There's no prophet that I know of, and that could be new information to me.
Yeah.
But to my knowledge, there isn't a leader of the Crossfield group or the School of the Prophets that officially claims to be the successor of Crossfield. I know at Sunstone a few years ago, someone did make the claim to being the successor, but I know that was supposedly recanted. I mean, I haven't talked to him, so I can't.
Was he the one that got up and proclaimed he was a prophet? Okay.
Don't put my face nodding at that. I just don't, because I looked so skeptical.
One of the things I love about Lindsay is she's like, prophets are a dime a dozen. I know so many of them.
Well, one of the interesting things is that Jim Harmston also announced his claim at Sunstone.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yep.
Oh, so we've got a long history.
And I only learned that from Ann Wild.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because Ann, apparently he had been saying no, I'm not going to start a group. No, I'm not going to start a group. And then he announces it.
At Sunstone.
And I'm sure she was like,
hey.
She is such a wealth of knowledge.
Oh, I know she is.
She's such a wealth of knowledge of just the inner workings of the movement for that period of time that is.
She's like Ogden Crouch, she's tied to everybody. And I know Christ Church. I mean, we did an episode with her and David Patrick on the 50th anniversary of Jesus Was Married.
Yep, I have a copy of that.
Because they were like, "Oh, this is a great book. Everybody should read it." Yeah, she's amazing. So that group is loosely still around.
I mean, the documents are, but I don't think it meets in a formal group.
Okay, maybe I'll have to contact him. Do you know Jacob Vidrine?
Yeah.
I need to get him on.
You need to get him on the show.
Is he with? Because
I'll let him tell his story.
Okay.
But he's. I mean.
Do you know what group he's in?
I'll let him tell his story.
I'll let him tell. Okay.
No, I mean, There's been so many moments where I've messaged him and been like, do you happen to have this one meeting minute account from this one School of the Prophets meeting in 1860, but it happened to be under, and he's like, yep. What? Like,
I do think he's in a group or part of a group, because the whole polygamy denier thing.
Oh yeah, the big debate that they did.
Was he part of that debate?
I supposedly there was two. I only saw one. The very first time that they debated each other, and I watched it.
I did watch it. I didn't watch it.
Yeah, I watched it because he told me that they were doing it, and I was just so interested in what.
Maybe I should go back.
Only because I think he's so knowledgeable about the history, and if I were debating, the history I do is more recent. It's not 19th century, and so if I were debating the 19th century, I wouldn't have felt confident going up against Jacob. So I was just interested.
I think there's a new Facebook group that I just got invited to that talks about contemporary evidence for polygamy, and they're trying to provide Nauvoo City Council minutes and things like that.
I mean, it's very hard to track a secret practice.
Yeah.
Turns out. But Joseph Smith, I'm going to say it, Rick. He practiced polygamy.
Oh, not a newsflash here.
Someone's going to be upset.
I'm sure.
I just think, yeah.
I think get something in the comments.
Well, especially the when I first learned about the Joseph Smith fought polygamy arguments. I think the part that was so, when I was like, I don't think this is true. Like, it was just so hard to wrap my head around, was the argument that Brigham Young actually wrote Doctrine and Covenants 132. Or that it was written and like that.
Well, I've heard it was a forgery, not that Brigham Young wrote it.
Or that he had it written, or that like it was found in like a shoebox, it was found in like a desk drawer or something.
Well, probably. The argument is it's not a legitimate thing.
Right, it wasn't written by Joseph.
It's not in Joseph's hand. Well,
of course it's not.
Joseph didn't write anything down except, he didn't even write the Book of Mormon down.
Because we don't have the original because it was destroyed.
Yeah.
And then we do have the Kingsbury 132 because it's hanging in the Church History Museum.
Yeah.
Like it's on the wall. It's next to the death mask.
Well, Emma burnt the other one, right?
Right. But it's in the room right next to the death mask in the Church History Museum. So we do have the Kingsbury edition, or the Kingsbury.
Well, the argument is he wasn't a scribe. Why would he have written it down? It's a forgery.
Correlation is causation. I don't know. But yeah, I think my concern about it is you have to defend first of all, the big question is why do you need to make him not a polygamist? I think that's a really interesting question.
Oh, it's a great question.
Like, I think that's the question that I'm most interested in when I talk to Joseph.
Joseph's not a liar. I've heard that so many times.
Right. Well, that's fine. I mean, he did though.
A prophet would never lie.
But I think that's the most fascinating question about the Joseph polygamy crowd is why do you need this to be the case about him? But secondarily, why are you willing to say that, to defend one man as not a liar at the detriment of saying all of these other people are? Like, it's so focused on vindicating this one person that you're willing to drag everyone. And that is a very strange way of telling history to me, especially with all the affidavits that we have.
They're late.
Here's the thing. Eliza R. Snow, I don't think she's lying about this. I do not think Eliza R. Snow is lying about polygamy. I don't think Eliza R. Snow is lying about it. And Eliza R. Snow is ride or die for polygamy. Like, if there's ever a defender of the practice, it's her. And I just really don't think she's lying about it. But the fact that, propping up Joseph Smith to the detriment of her, that feels very strange to me. But I think the dire need to make him not a polygamist is fascinating. It's just a fascinating story that why do you need him to be a monogamist? I mean, I like monogamy, however, but I'm also not, a part of the restoration. I'm part of the non-restored gospel. So I think that's
You're part of the original Christian church.
We like to think so. The Orthodox are like,
no
so are
apostasy.
we. I don't think there was a great apostasy. Sorry, listener. I don't. But which is, I mean, fine. It's a faith claim, and we all have them. But I just don't believe in that. But yeah, I do think the Joseph fought polygamy debate is one of the most interesting current things happening in Mormonism. Especially because it's something that's happened so many times historically. This is just the most recent iteration of trying to figure out if polygamy was from Joseph Smith. The RLDS went through that moment. They acknowledge he practiced polygamy now. But they are a monogamous church. So
they're just a bunch of apostates anyway. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Cristina Rosetti. In our final conversation, we're going to talk about the Great and Abominable Church. Is that the Catholic Church? And what does Cristina think about that?
Bruce R. McConkie said it's me. My people.
And? You weren't offended?
He's allowed to think that. I mean, here's the thing. It's not like the Catholic Church has high views of the LDS Church. Right? Like, it's not like we've been just so kind to LDS people that, like...
A little blowback's okay.
Yeah, it's fine. I'll take it. It's fine.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, you can hear the audio only at patreon.com/gospeltangents. For just $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview with no interruptions. If you want to watch the entire video for just $8 a month, you can also sign up at Patreon or on youtube.com/gospeltangents and just subscribe here. You can watch the entire video uncut before everybody else. Also, if you'd like to continue to support Gospel Tangents, you can either sign up for our $10 or $20 memberships, or you can get some cool gear like this hat. I've got the coffee mugs like this here. We've got sweatshirts and t-shirts, and I'm even thinking about ties. Somebody said they wanted a tie, so I'll see if I can get that on my store. So go to gospeltangents.com store, and you can get some Gospel Tangents gear. So you don't want to miss that. So anyway, thanks for listening. If you'd like to check out some of our other videos, check out here.